I'm Daryl Wanzer Serrano.
I'm Ariana Ruiz.
I'm Rene Rocha, and this is Imagining Latinidades. Great. Well, thank you. So we're here at the end of our third day of our opening conference for Imagining Latinidades, and we're going to have a conversation with two of our speakers who are speaking today, Claudia and Natalia, and also our opening keynote speaker. So we're going to bring it back full circle, talking with Ana Sampaio. So we want to begin by just kind of getting to know our guests a little bit better, doing some of the things that we've all done individually, and we've done with some of the other people we've interviewed, of just trying to get an understanding of sort of like what brought you all into studies, into sort of, Latino, Latinx studies. And, some of the things that I'm interested in, especially given sort of my own background and my own biography, to sort of help guide you as you give us that overview, are questions related to sort of like how natural it was for you to find yourself sort of in that intellectual space. If it was something that maybe you intended to do sort of as you began your sort of career in academia, if it was something that you sort of wandered into, sort of when in your intellectual process you wandered into it, and maybe sort of like how easy it is or how difficult it was to sort of make that commitment and make that transition. One of the things that I think is really interesting as we have these conversations is we all come from very different disciplinary backgrounds. And of course, the presence of Latino, Latinx studies in these different disciplines varies widely. The institutionalization of it varies widely. And so the ability to sort of move into that space and what it means to move into that space and how it affects our relationship with the sort of more historical centers of our disciplines is something that I think is sort of really interesting. So those are some of the guidelines to sort of like get us started. And why don't I go ahead? I'm a political scientist by training. Anna's a political scientist by training. So I'm going to go ahead and start off here, and then we can sort of move on.
Great, thank you, Rene. I appreciate that. So I love this question about origin stories because I think it does tell a lot about how we develop as academics. And so for me, my origin story is really grounded in my undergraduate experience. I came to the university as an undergraduate with already a sense of questions about injustice and inequality from my own life experiences, some of which I shared on Thursday from my family's history. And they were both questions about race, about ethnicity, about immigration, about gender, about displacement. But I didn't necessarily have the language to put to those sensibilities about inequality. And what I found when I came to the university is that ethnic studies gave me that language. And it wasn't something that I knew I would find automatically. It was by virtue of taking classes. And so in some ways it was a bit accidental. It wasn't the accident of knowing that there was injustice. It was the accident of finding ethnic studies as a discipline specifically. And then I was fortunate to go to a university with a strong mission in social justice. It's actually the university I'm at now. So I came back after years in other places. And because it's a Jesuit university, it's really grounded in this idea of education of the whole person with a commitment to social justice, that is, to institutional transformation in the world. And in that context, I was fortunate to be mentored by really strong Latina feminists, namely Alma Garcia, Bernice Zamora, but also really interdisciplinary ethnic studies scholars, Francisco Jimenez, who comes out of the humanities, Dwight Hopkins, who is this amazing African-American theologian doing just amazing work in history. And that training really provided me with a context to understand Latina, Latino, Latinx studies from a really interdisciplinary, multi-method, and intersectional perspective. And that's really what I walked into graduate school with, but that's not what I found in graduate school. And so for me, the graduate school experience was a real fundamental counter to how I came to Latina, Latino, and Latinx studies, which was in this very interdisciplinary, intersectional way. In graduate school, in political science, I'm sure you know, and you've had this experience, Rene, as well, I was in a department that had made a very decidedly behavioral and positivistic shift. And what that meant when I got there was I could effectively, and I was literally told this, I could study anything I wanted. it wasn't the question of what I studied, it was how I studied it. And so I could study Latinos, I could study Latinas, but I had to do so through this decidedly behavioral and really positivistic and very specifically quantitative lens, which meant a kind of atomized perspective that really quashed all of the politics out of the discipline and out of the kind of approach. So for me, it became really a struggle to not only study the subject, but a question for how I would study the subject. And that really became my life's work of trying to recover that interdisciplinary, multi-method, and intersectional perspective in the course of my own work.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Anna. How about you, Claudia?
Thanks, Rene. So I guess I would also, like Anna, trace it back to my undergraduate days. And I would say it's just having, not necessarily in language, but going up to the library and finding things that were Central America and being completely horrified by the absence and just finding banana republics, dictatorships, and natural disasters and thinking, oh my God, is this all I am? And so it was just this larger question of what am I? Very invisible man in that Ellisonian sense. And so when I got to graduate school, I went in an American Studies program, and being there was an encounter that was unusual in the sense that the quote disciplinary space unquote that made most sense to me was the Africana space, because it was so marginal. And so I ended up working with a Black existentialist philosopher, Lewis Gordon, and realizing that Central America was not that different in terms of how Africa gets discussed as the zone of underdevelopment. And that in many ways gave me, I think, a lot of ways to think through race comparatively and processes of racialization and trying to productively work through the margins. Being in American studies, and I should say, because I don't have any Latino studies training, but it's always been an interdisciplinary space, and it just so happens that the kinds of questions that I have very much are in line with how to move the field forward and thinking about Latino studies in a rather global way.
Thank you. Natalia?
I grew up in a multi-ethnic, multiracial area, Echo Park. That is now the subject of my book. And so I grew up with working class whites, gays and lesbians, Vietnamese refugees, Chinese nationals, Filipinos, mixed race families. And there was a way in which all the kids, regardless of their background, had certain experiences that were in common. We all knew, like when the police came by, that was not good, we would scatter. We all knew the way in which Echo Park was seen as this urban wasteland. And then when we got to high school, I started seeing how institutions marked us differently and tracked us differently. And so I was really interested in what we had in common, but what also separated us. And then I went to UCLA, and I did gender studies, and that was my way of understanding race, was through gender studies. And so I took classes with Valerie Smith, Ned Blackhawk was my TA, during summer teeing, Daphne Brooks, Dwight McBride, so people understanding race and gender in these broad relational ways, which is the way that I understood my racialized experiences. I also had I was fortunate to take classes with Sonia Sardibat Hall, and she took the mission of undergraduate teaching really seriously. So like Gloria and Zaldúa came to our campus, and she invited her undergrads and grads to meet with her and to go to lunch with her. All these experiences were really important. And, one of probably my most formative teachers was a white woman who's a Marxist, Sandra Hale, in women's studies, an anthropologist. And through all of this, then I was encouraged to go to grad school. And luckily there was a Mellon Ford program, a summer research exchange, which, I think if you trace a lot of first-gen people's experiences on how they got to academia, a lot of them were part of some kind of program that helped them. Or a very influential professor like Sandra Hale or like Sonia Sardibat Hall. And that's when I realized, maybe I'll pick a discipline. And so it was like one of these, like, what discipline will I pick? And so I picked history because it just seemed like I could tell stories that way. And the intro series requirement wasn't onerous. That was about how I came there. And luckily I came to work with George Sanchez, but I was always interested in that relational part of race because of how I grew up. And then just, spaces like this is why we continue to learn. I really love that, the way that Claudia talked about that Latinx is always evolving. And so I think unless we keep up with it in this interdisciplinary way, we get stuck in a certain moment. So thank you for the invitation here.
Yeah, no, this is great. And I think this really preempts what's the sort of second question that's written down here. So when we're talking about these origin stories, what I hear across all of you is this very strong interest in the idea of sort of ethnic studies to begin with, and then this sort of like finding yourself in a disciplinary space and then trying to navigate a disciplinary space with this primary emphasis in sort of ethnic studies. And so the second question is sort of about how you continue to do that in your career, right? So the extent to which studying the type of populations you're studying, asking the questions that you need to ask in order to understand this population causes you to have sort of approaches, methodological approaches, or other sort of like investigative or modes of inquiry, which sort of like run up against the dominant modes of inquiry in your fields, right? So like, all of you sort of touched on this, to varying degrees, and sort of the, sort of talking about sort of how you navigate that. Of course, that question is a little bit different given that the dominant modes of inquiry vary across our fields. And then what that says about sort of the need for Latino and ethnic studies as an interdisciplinary space, given what I suspect many of you or each of you are going to say is sort of a tension between the sort of approaches you need and the sort of more common dominant approaches in your fields. So Anna, why don't we go ahead and start with you? Yeah,
it's a great follow-up question. I think about how I approach this, living in this kind of interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary life. And I have to say, on the one hand, it's mediated by my status. And that's to say, it is a much easier game to navigate now that I'm a little more senior than when I was a little bit more junior. And that's in part because of the institutional constraints that we live in. And so I spent the first 10 years of my life in a political science department, and in a fairly traditional political science department, which meant that I had to satisfy requirements for merit, for tenure, for promotion that were tied to that disciplinary constraint. And, that meant publishing in academic journals that didn't necessarily welcome a multi-method approach and certainly didn't welcome this kind of critical analysis about race, about gender and inequality. There was just no framework in political science at the time to really appreciate that in the major publishing houses. And so it was constantly a struggle as I was coming through the tenure process. As I achieved tenure and then moved through different institutions, it got easier every step along the way. Now, I moved from political science to a women and gender studies department at Rutgers, and then I moved to my current institution where I'm in ethnic studies, and I have a courtesy line in political science. And now, both by virtue of my physical location as well as my status, I can afford to be driven more by the questions than by the genuflecting to the discipline. That is to say, I am really interested in this question about the change in political context for Latinos, Latinas, Latinxes in the really over the last 30 years, and what that has meant, particularly for immigrants, but also for naturalized and natural-born citizens. So looking at immigration as this kind of shifting body, both in a discursive form, in a legal form, and in an implementation form, and trying to track that has really forced me to become even more interdisciplinary, because in some cases I'm borrowing from political science, in some cases I'm borrowing from history, in some cases I'm borrowing from comparative studies. In some cases, I'm constructing my own databases to try to answer the question. So it becomes more that I'm trying to answer the question, and I have a bit more freedom to be able to do so. I'm constantly in awe of junior scholars who have the both tenacity and frankly the courage to kind of pursue these questions, even when it means they're coming up against what are still these very real constraints. I know in political science, I'm sure in other disciplines as well, that often cost them things like mentors or even fellowships or sometimes the accolades of their department, right? I think that there is a tremendous amount of courage that's happening right now as junior scholars have pushed these disciplinary boundaries even further. So,
how about you, Claudia?
I guess my method it's always been there all along. It's just thinking about the instability of the Latin signifier. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm in American studies. I was trained in American studies, but I work in a Roman studies department. And so a lot of that has to do, for me, is thinking about how these spaces of working within former empires, and there's the significance of that within Latinx populations. And so my concerns, I think, are getting more and more global in scope. What are the problems or the new sets of questions, for instance, that migrants in Spain bring to the fore, or migrants in Italy? That, to me, has been really crucial. And I think in terms of other questions, I would say maybe the things that we should, talk about as just the scholars in general. I don't think we ever talk about writing processes, and that becomes really key in terms of what our approach should be, and that's applicable to any field. Concerns that also connect with junior faculty too.
Natalia?
So my first book, Fit to be Citizens, Public Health and Race, was mainly focused on Mexicans, but it starts with a chapter on the Chinese, then the Japanese, and looking at all the ways in which, all the structural and cultural ways in which these communities fit into a racial hierarchy in LA end up setting the stage for Mexicans, also the erasure of Mexicans that were already there. And when I first started, my press first sent the book out, some of the readers' reports said, we really need this book. We don't really have very much on public health or health discourses and race, and especially in terms of these communities. But can you cut out the Chinese and Japanese? It just kind of makes it a little bit messy. We want Mexicans and public health. And so it was one of these things, like I so understood it that way a lot because of my formation, a lot because that's what I was seeing, was that, there wasn't like an archive for this work. And so I can see the whole picture. And I knew that health officials, yes, they weren't offering these services to Chinese and Japanese because they were coordinating, making sure they were contained in parts of the city. They were disciplining them, whereas Mexicans, they were trying to assimilate and whitewash their culture. And I felt it was really important to study that within this larger frame. And so luckily, I did have encouragement of mentors that said, sounds good, go for it. And so rather than cutting them out, I redid the book a couple times, and it got published. So it's interesting to me, fast forward 15 years, my editor at the same press comes to me and says, racial scripts is a really helpful concept. Maybe you can do an edited volume on this. And I was like, great. Because 15 years ago, you wanted me, the press wanted me to cut it out. But, I do think it's also because it continues to evolve. And then I also want to bring up another point when you say, how do you keep learning about this? And we talked about this a little bit at lunch. Service, we're often thinking about service and how do we say no? What do we say yes to? For me, I look at service as what is going to be a learning opportunity. And so service has been one of the ways that I stay up on the field. I was on the American Quarterly Board for about 6 years. I read for the University of California Press a lot. So, these are these ways that we continue to learn from younger scholars, and as well as teaching, right? I mean, how many of us use teaching as a way to say, I've been meaning to read that book. And so, I know that the next time I teach, I'm going to teach Genevieve Carpio's Collisions at the Crossroads. I know the next time I teach, I'm going to teach Lara Bearclaw's new book on Charros. I know the next time I teach, I'm going to teach Juan de Lara's book on the Inland Shift. So, teaching we shouldn't see as competition, and teaching and service we shouldn't see as competition with our writing, but as a way to enhance it.
Yeah, great. And, sort of inject some of my own perspective into this. One of the things you just said, you mentioned in your discussion here, which relates back to your talk earlier today. You said, well, there's not an archive for that. And one of the themes in your talk was the sort of issue of doing work when, maybe sort of traditional archives don't have a lot of information on. So this is the sort of like subjects or the individuals, whom you're trying to study, right? And so that instantly struck a chord with me as a sort of like quantitatively trained political scientist, right? Who is oftentimes trained to understand the world through, sources of data, right? And so we had Valerie Martinez Ebers on the show yesterday. She one of her many accomplishments is doing something called the Latino National Survey in 2006, which was only the second nationally representative survey of Latinos ever done in political science and social sciences at all. It's actually the first one that was ever publicly released in a timely manner, and it's 2006, right? So I got my PhD in 2006, which meant that at the time I got my PhD, there were 0 of those surveys that had ever been done in a timely manner, right? And so in some ways, despite different disciplines, right, it's a very, very similar process of how am I going to do this type of work when the type of, when sort of my analogy to an archive, sort of large scale data sets on this population doesn't exist, right? And so it's really sort of fascinating to me how we face similar issues despite widely different fields, and despite the fact that sort of the the things which we are sort of being asked, the types of information or evidence upon which we are being asked to draw by our relative disciplines is so different, yet we still face such similar constraints. So that's just struck me as really fascinating, given your talk this morning. Okay. The other thing that sort of, again, many issues that we sort of want to talk about here, this is a little bit of a shift, but we're just sort of interested in your perspectives. And this is also great because, your appointments are in such different fields. And I'm especially interested to hear your perspective on this, Anna, having existed within a political science department, a gender studies department, and an ethnic studies department, is basically the role of Latino Latinx studies in higher education and its value basically as an independent space instead of its value as sort of like a theme running across different units.
Yeah, this is it's actually the first week of my classes. So any of my students that may be listening are going to hear my first lecture, which is I pose the question, why study? Typically, I'm teaching Latino, Latinx politics of some sort. Sometimes I'm teaching a more general introductory to ethnic studies, but I think the questions are still relevant. But why study this, right? Most of them are coming to classes because there is a core requirement that they're trying to fill. Right? That's how the preponderance of them come. But there are certainly an opportunity for us to introduce them to bigger questions and to pique their interest to pursue additional studies. And for me, there are 3 really big reasons why you would pursue Latino, Latinx studies beyond just a requirement. One of which is the obvious question, which Val and Gina and Arlene yesterday addressed beautifully, which has to do with the demographic shifts, right? Is that we're living in a country that is increasingly more diverse, and particularly around race and ethnicity. Latino, Latinx population constitutes the largest racial ethnic minority population in the country, and they've done so now for about 2 decades. So if you want to understand race and ethnicity in America, you better understand what it is, the history of this population and their contemporary existence, right? So the shifting demographics and the literal changing face of the country begs us to be more intellectually and culturally competent, right? It's one of the reasons. 2 is that I think there are some of the most generative questions coming out of this discipline, right? As I said before, it is interdisciplinary, it is intersectional, it is timely, and as my colleagues have suggested, it is also applying its own sort of methodological lens, whether that is intersectionality or a kind of Latinx lens. It is introducing new research questions, new methodological, new heuristic lenses, and even asking of traditional fields, like in my case, political science, new questions that it hadn't heretofore answered and applying a new interpretive lens. And so it's really generative in that sense, that it allows us to push traditional disciplines, but also create new disciplinary spaces. But the third reason, and I constantly find no shortage of examples to show to my students, is that it's a really good idea to take these classes. It's a really good idea to pursue these so you don't embarrass yourself, your family, your business, your political party into extinction. There is a pressing need to understand and to be responsive to these populations and to not just deride and dismiss. And whether it's a university president who decides to hold a taco party in the most denigrating form, as has happened at universities, or it's a president of a political party that decides to run an entire campaign targeting this population, both are, unsustainable, whether it's a gaffe or decided, they're unsustainable gestures. And really this kind of discipline allows us to move beyond that. So
great. I love that. Thank you. Claudia?
I would say in addition to what Anna just said, it's also a space that allows us to think about geographically how a lot of these regions are being remapped by these migrations. I'm thinking a lot about the Southeast in particular, coming from North Carolina. Though Latina, Latinx studies is there, of course, for Latino students who are directly impacted by a lot of these concerns and questions. I also want to emphasize that I think it should be an opening for all undergraduates or graduate students to come and take these courses to understand the landscape of the United States and the Americas. And that is key. For me, coming from a Roman Studies department, is just seeing how a lot of students are that are not Latin American or Latino speaking Spanish. It's also bears a responsibility of what their relationship is to a language that is racialized, that is proletarianized, and making sure that they see their ethical relationship to it as well. So the kinds of questions that Latino studies programs, in my case, it's a program, I would say it's unique, and it's also there as a resource for all students.
Yeah, no, I love that idea. You're talking about the importance of understanding it in this sort of in these different geographic spaces, right? So we're here in Iowa City, right, which is a place which, like historically, as you go back, it has had a smaller, not an absent, but a smaller Latino population, right? And then it's had a population which has grown pretty dramatically over the past few decades. And in fact, sort of like an origin of Latino studies at this university, if you go back about 15 or so years, it was actually a movement led by some staff, right? With the student population is smaller at that point in time, the undergraduate student population, and the faculty population is, of course, sort of non-existent. And going over to the provost and presenting him with some of these emerging demographic shifts, and sort of like trying to convince the administration to sort of get ahead of the curve, that they needed to build the institutional capacity at Iowa in order to deal with the fact that in 10, 15, 20 years, they're going to have an undergraduate student population, which was increasingly more diverse. And they needed the faculty here now to be able to help interact and absorb that population. And also that the undergraduates who weren't from that population were going to be interacting, like your guys are saying, and is improving issues of sort of cultural competency. We're going to be interacting in this increasingly diverse state, right? And that they needed some capacity to help understand and navigate that, right? So, and we're here in Iowa City talking about that. You're talking about it in other sort of non-traditional destinations in North Carolina, right? And so I think that's sort of a call for expanding the study, again, not just outside of the institutions which have historically sort of been the places it's housed. Not all of those places have been in sort of traditionally states with large Latino populations, but many of them have been. So yeah, that's great. How about you, Natalia?
I'll give you three. I like that, 3 talking points. I'm going to give you 3 stories. So the first one, in terms of the demographic shifts, one of my favorite examples of that is I taught in a teacher credential program before, I was finishing up my dissertation before I went to UC San Diego. And it was like multicultural pedagogy, something like that. And it was required. And, in Los Angeles, you have like 75, 80 languages taught in LA Unified. But one of the students, what he was going to do his program there, but he was going to go back to where his hometown in Appleton, Wisconsin. And so his thing was, interesting, I'm going to teach in Appleton, Wisconsin, don't need to know this. And I remember coming in one day with the front page of the New York Times about immigration to Appleton, Wisconsin in the industry. I was like, ta-da, we all need to know. We're all coming for you. The browning of America means you have to learn this. The other thing is I do use newspaper articles a lot, or the debates, or music videos in my class. So, thinking about the, presidential debates and I taught Latino studies to undergrads in the last semester. And, looking at the debates, and it's so easy to say that it's, Trump's, evil, but he didn't create this discourse, right? And what are the ways in which, even when the Democrat candidates are trying to redeem something, that they demonize another community or make it invisible. And so we're able to connect those data points. Also, again, thinking about race relationally, it was during that semester that 21 Savage was arrested and deported. And what did it mean to think about immigration through a sort of a Black African diaspora through a Black lens? And so all these kinds of things, help us understand why we need lots of data points to connect, and we can connect them differently and tell a larger story if we do. And then the third thing I would say is getting back to your kind of methodology, and this gets at your methodology question. If you know what's going on in Latino studies, you know why certain problems may not be obvious to other people. So I remember, all the discourse on Obamacare, why, once it passed, why weren't Latinos signing up? But if you're reading the paper, you see that at the same time, there's all the newspaper articles on Latinos not signing up for Obamacare alongside all the anti-immigration discourse and the ways that, you can picture Latinos being scared to sign up for this. So I wrote this article about it, and I submitted it to an interdisciplinary journal. And, as has happened to all of us who do interdisciplinary work, you get like 4 readers' reports and 3 people are like, this is genius. And one person's like, what's wrong with her? Then she used methodology. Where's her data set? And I remember sending it to John McKiernan Gonzalez, because he also works on public health. I'm like, they say I need a data set. What? He goes, what, like regression analysis? Like neither of us know what that means, right? So,
You're speaking our language.
So I went back, I reframed it in terms of, different, all these different things. And in the meantime, as I'm doing this, Kaiser comes out with a study showing Latinos were afraid to sign up for healthcare. And I send that in, and they're like, yeah, but can you get access to the data? And in the meantime, that's when all the all the moves to all the people had signed up for DACA status, that the government had all the information, and now they wanted to use that information. So even if they were legal, they wanted to use it to, put their families on notice. So, through all these kinds of things that you realize, we may not always have the empirical data, but we need Latino studies to ask the questions.
Yeah. And, one thing that sort of strikes me, and I think it goes back to some of our earlier questions, the idea of having the space to have, sort of the room to ask these questions. And I think there's a lot of themes emerging. We're talking about, when we started this conversation, we're talking about, right, well, what's the importance here for helping basically, non-Latino students, for helping them develop sort of cultural competencies. And one theme I'm getting here is what's the importance of having this space in order to be able to help our colleagues in the discipline have a better understanding of sort of the questions that they're dealing with in their disciplines. And so it's to sort of like politicize this and help it make I don't know if it helps to make more sense, but it helps to make it more sense to me. Like when you're studying this population, oftentimes what you'll find is that traditional, basically explanations of, say, political behavior fall apart when you're studying this population. Now, if you have an explanation of political behavior and it falls apart when studying this population, what it means is you don't have an explanation of political behavior, right? It means you have an explanation of white political behavior, which you've assumed is a population of political behavior broadly speaking, right? And so by having the space to ask questions that apply to this population, you actually sort of produce a better set of knowledge. You sort of you sort of keep others from sort of believing that the way that they understand the world is sort of universally true, instead of actually affected by the types of populations which they are studying, which are exclusive of the Latino community. So so it's funny how like we're talking how that theme is true in terms of like let's help non-Latino undergraduates, or let's help our white colleagues understand their sort of studies a little bit better by asking questions within the auspice of Latino studies.
Can I just say something? Because I think that's really one of the contemporary contributions about Latino, Latina, Latinx studies. Just like any discipline, this is a field that has gone through lots of different iterations, right? Not just in nomenclature, but in terms of methodology, in terms of contributions. There is this genesis that is in part a challenge to the various academic disciplines in the way they let out or left out the population, or they had misconstrued the population. But there is also this genesis that was about recovering the stories of the population, so very much grounded in history. But I think now we've got some really interesting work. Mary Hawksworth in Women and Gender Studies, actually, in political science, had done this work on racializing and gendering studies in political science. And I found this so incredibly helpful, along with work by colleague Natalia Molina, taking what are otherwise seemingly neutral things, like for me, budget bills or legislative language, and demonstrating the way that these are in fact not universal, not, as you would say, applicable to all populations in the same fashion, but that they are in fact coded and racialized, and they are gendered. And it takes a particular lens, and it takes a particular skill, and it takes a particular training to be able to draw that out. And I think it's really helpful. It's really instructive to our colleagues in what are sort of canonical disciplines to be able to demonstrate how the things that they thought were universal, replicatable, are in fact not. They are in fact grounded and specific and manifest in a particular positionality that is not universal. And I see. So I think that's part of the transition and the evolution of this discipline itself.
That's great. One last question. So we're sort of go around. And so the question is, again, it's a little bit of a shift here. Is what message? And I think this is sort of a nice way to sort of conclude. Is what message would you give to a listener here, a Latino, Latinx listener, who sort of feels like they don't belong, right? Given your experiences, given where you were, where you've come to now, right, at a place where you're invited to come, speak across the country, obviously, as evident by your presence here, right? Given that set of experiences, what would you say to somebody, again, just feeling that, and maybe feeling that in a sort of like, not necessarily, in maybe like in a way that they can't even sort of articulate?
I would say first and foremost, we are you. That is exactly the experience every single one of us in this room has had. I see that in my undergraduates. I see myself in my undergraduates every single day. That kind of anxiety, that pain, that isolation, that confusion, that self-doubt. I see it, and that's because I was there. I would say that part of the reason I am so drawn continually to Latino, Latinx studies is because it's a home. And I say that in the largest sense of the word. It is an intellectual home. I have colleagues that inspire me every single day, including the folks here today in this amazing academic space. So it's an intellectual and academic project. It is a political project. That is, it's not just about being satisfied with the status quo. It's about trying to create a more democratic, equal, just society. And it's a personal project. It's about validating where you are. It's about seeing your life's experience as having value in the university. It's about centering your subjectivity and giving that breath and life and allowing that to then inform your academic career. And so it is very much a home. We often use this term family to describe Latino, Latinx studies. And really it's because there is a sense of care and a sense of comfortableness that is generated from that. Like any family, it's not without tension. That happens in every family. But that care is what ultimately endures. And so I would say, come check out a Latino Studies department, because I think you'll find that kind of attention and care.
Thanks, Claudia.
I would say just carve your own space. Make sure you go talk to professors during office hours. Get to know them. These are the people who will also help you write letters of recommendation, help you in the process of professionalization. You have to claim that space and make sure that you go talk to your professors. And oftentimes they'll be a lot more helpful than you realize. And you have to find those spaces for surviving and thriving.
Natalia?
When I received my PhD in U.S. history, I was the 21st Chicana to do so. I mean, it was at that point where we could actually count. And it was, that's also why I showed that LA Times cover, because, we were so invisible and it was such a big deal to, even start talking about this. And part of the reason I know I'm 21 is the number 21, because Dina Gonzalez kept a list. And so she actually would write out the list, and we would go to, National Association of Chicano Studies, which evolved that year. That first year that I went, it used to be Chicano Studies, and it was Chicana Studies. And we would have lunch together, like number 7 is here, number 14, and as many of us as we could would go, those who weren't sick or had passed or, had suffered from the profession in some terrible way. So, don't look for that broader world for validation. You don't need them. Look for your community, the people who prop you up. There's a lot of haters out there. Even in, I think of the field in that way, but even my graduate program, one of the reasons I went to graduate school at the University of Michigan was, yes, to study with these great professors, but I like the graduate student population. I went in with Adrian Burgos. The year after us, Pablo Mitchell came. Soon after, Frank Garritti came. In front of me was Nancy Raquel Mirabal. Also, John McKiernan Gonzalez, and everybody helped each other. Like, we didn't need a huge community. We just needed that one person that showed us, if we go to Detroit together, we can buy tortillas. And let me give you the books that I have so that you don't have to buy them all. And actually, let's meet before class and talk about things, because you're going to be rated on your performance. And so you want to go in with some talking points. And so, really finding out what community is there. And then the last thing is community in sort of intellectual formation space, right? So read broadly. You don't know who you're going to be in conversation with. And Latino studies is a field with different methodologies, different vocabularies. And so what I often see with graduate students is they're under so much pressure, and I totally understand this, to teach and to get their writing done. And now they're, get a publication, that they sometimes don't go to talks or go talk to the professors because they're busy and they're under a lot of stress. But if you want to be able to talk to as many people as you can, go to people whose talks just seem interesting. So I talked to a graduate student this week, and I asked her, "What have you read this semester?" It's her first year, like third week of classes. I said, "What have you read this year?" She doesn't think of herself as a historian at all. I said, "What have you read this year or this semester that you're excited about?" And she said, Rosina Lozana's An American Language. It's a history of the Spanish language in the U.S. And she said, "I didn't know you could use archives to tell these kinds of stories." It sparkled, right? So find your joy with people, with books, with ideas. Just find your joy.
Great. I can't think of a more perfect note to end on than that. Thank you for everyone here for listening. And as always, please follow us on Twitter at ImaginingLat. Email us at podcast@imagininglatinidades.com. Share our podcast, rate our podcast. If you're going to give us 5 stars, rate our podcast. And thanks for listening, and check the show notes for links to some of the materials that we've been discussing today. Thank you.